Hi team, this is the final video for monetary policy where we are going to look at the strengths and weaknesses. So you need to understand the strengths and weaknesses of using monetary policy to affect aggregate demand and then its influence on the achievement of the macroeconomic goals and living standards. So nothing new with respect to macroeconomic goals and living standards. The concepts and the ideas that were brought up in the previous video still remain. We're now just going to come in and put ourselves in a position where we are able to discuss the effectiveness of monetary policy with respect to its strengths and its weaknesses. So I've got the strengths and weaknesses sort of set out as simply as possible. It's your job to be able to put this in a discussion where you would then provide a balanced view depending on the mark allocations to the question. So does the question require one strength and one weakness? Does it require two strengths or two weaknesses? This is going to depend obviously on the particular mark allocation that's afforded to the question. A rule of thumb is that if you were going to speak to a strength of monetary policy, one of them is going to be approximately worth 2 marks, okay? So you get a mark for identifying the strength, you then get your second mark for explaining it with a little bit of further detail. You might be invited in the question to link it to a domestic macroeconomic goal. You might be invited to speak to living standards. So take a global view of this, all right? What I mean by that is making sure you understand the strengths and weaknesses, but that you're flexible enough to pivot and apply them in whatever context might be thrown at you. Okay, so strength number one, the RBA is independent from the government, okay? The RBA is not the government. They are separate bodies. They are separate entities. The government at this stage has no influence over the RBA. In reality, that's not entirely true, but from a practicality perspective for our understanding, we're just going to go with it, okay? If you are interested in learning more, you'll find out more once you start to learn about monetary policy at university. So all decisions that are made by the RBA are free from political bias and are made in the best interest of the economy. The RBA is not worried about pleasing voters, okay? They don't have to pander to any particular voter group or keep anyone happy. They just get to make decisions and they don't really need to worry about the implications that it may have on their popularity. And so with respect to the economy, they're much more likely, in comparison to the government, to make decisions that are just straight up in the best interest of the economy and that align with their charter, okay? Another strength of monetary policy is that it's got a short implementation lag, and I'll talk about this one in the next video, but the short implementation lag is the time between the policy being proposed and then enacted. So what we mean by that with respect to the RBA decide they're going to change the cash rate, and then pretty much overnight the cash rate changes through open market operations and other such policies, okay? So it's really quick. There's a short implementation lag, which is a good thing. The RBA looks at the economy and they go, wow, something's wrong. We need to change the cash rate now. They can pretty much get away with changing the cash rate as soon as it needs to be changed. There is no lengthy political process that monetary policy is subject to. Again, this is in comparison to the government, right? If the government want to put a policy in place, it has to go through the legislative process. It has to be passed through Parliament. It has to go through both houses. It takes a long time, okay? So the government might look at the economy and think, wow, we really want to do this thing. We believe it's going to have these positive impacts on this economic issue over here. The reality is the implementation lag in government is very long, okay? So the strength of monetary policy is that they've got a short implementation lag. The other one is influence of expectations. So the RBA are highly respected, and concerns expressed by the RBA governor without actually doing anything, without actually changing the cash rate, can have a powerful influence on consumers, investors, borrowers, and lenders, okay? So a little bit like what I was talking about in terms of unconventional monetary policy, one of the benefits of monetary policy is that the RBA governor can put out messaging and put out communications that can exert influence on all sorts of different stakeholders in the economy, and they don't actually have to change the cash rate, okay? So once again, that weight that sits behind what they have to say is highly influential. The weaknesses of monetary policy, the big one being the fact that it's what we refer to as a blunt instrument, okay? So changes in the cash rate hit everybody. You can't change the cash rate for this stakeholder over here, but then not change the cash rate for this stakeholder over here. If the cash rate changes, it hits everyone. which, you know, once again, if we contrast that to the government policies can be really, really targeted. Governments might look at the education sector and think, right, we're going to pump some subsidies into that space because we specifically want to support access for students to school to improve the quality of teaching, blah, 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 right? The RBA can't do that. They change interest rates, or they change the cash rate, which then changes interest rates, and it hits everybody. And so there may be unintended consequences elsewhere. Okay, so that's a weakness. The second weakness is what we refer to as the impact lag. Now, in the previous slide, we talked about the implementation lag as being a benefit. Here we're talking about our impact lag as being a weakness. So it can take up to 18 months for changes in monetary policy to have their intended effect on aggregate demand. So think about all your transmission mechanisms for a moment. We're saying that it can take up to 18 months for the change in the cash rate to have its intended impact on aggregate demand. That's quite a long time in an economic sense. If you think about the fluctuations that the RBA are trying to dampen, the negative thing here is that it can take a long time for those changes in interest rates to channel through the economy and have their intended impact. The other one is that the RBA have no direct control over interest rates, remembering that interest rates are managed by commercial banks. The RBA have direct control over the cash rate, which influences the interest rate. But the banks might turn around and say, you know what, we actually don't want to pass on the full decrease or increase in the cash rate. Doesn't happen very often, but it can happen, particularly throughout COVID. The RBA took on a highly expansionary stance. They reduced the cash rate as low as 0.1%. And sometimes when they cut the cash rate, the commercial banks didn't pass on the full interest rate cut, because you've got to remember that the interest rates are what the banks use to make money. So the central bank might have cut, the cash rate by 15 basis points or whatever, but the commercial bank might have only passed on 10 basis points. And so because they don't have that direct control, it obviously could have negative consequences if the RBA are seeking a specific outcome. All right. I wanted to put this in a visual sense because it does make a bit more sense when you see it. I've already spoken about these two, but basically if you look at this timeline over here, you've got your implementation lag on the left, and on the right you've got your impact lag, and this is in respect to monetary policy. So this is just a repeat, but basically we're saying that monetary policy has a short implementation lag, so the time between the policy being proposed and then enacted, and in this case we're talking about the changing of the cash rate, so nice and quick. However, once the cash rate has changed, it can have a long impact lag, which is the time between the policy being enacted and having its intended effect. It can be up to 18 months, which is quite lengthy. Okay. Now this is important because in a moment when we get into budgetary policy and we look at what the government does, we're going to start to see that these two things are flipped. The government have quite a lengthy implementation lag, but they have quite a short impact lag. So important to note. All right, thanks guys.